Hello guys, my name is Tadeu Primo. I am an airline pilot here in Brazil. I fly currently the Airbus A320, Airbus A321. I also have a degree in computer science and I have about 14,000 hours flying online on iVail and VATSIM. So I fly flight simulator since 1998 and probably I have a thing or two to share with the flight simulator community about flight simulators in general. My goal today is update the video that I made in the past for the Quest 2. Now that we are using the Quest 3, the Flight Simulator 2024, I think it's time to update the tips and tricks about the Quest 3 setup. My goal is to extract the maximum quality, performance, and visual clarity. And we will not need to use any kind of software like Virtual Desktop and whatever. Another thing that I want to mention is that this video is made from a pilot perspective, not a gamer perspective. You need to keep that in mind. My priorities are completely different sometimes because my only one goal is to have the maximum clarity and resolution to use in the Quest 3. So probably we will be a little bit disappointed with what my settings that I'm using inside the sim, but if you understand that 1% here, 1% there that I'm extracting using a lower setting that most people are using, the final product is that you have a lot of resources available to extract a little bit more of resolution. Don't underestimate the settings that are in almost a minimum setting because they are there for a reason. I would like to emphasize too that the intention of this video is to show you how to balance your system for the best smoothness and sharpness. However, every computer have a different configuration. So if you come here to copy the numbers that I'm using in my settings to apply to your settings in your PC, I think you have a bad time with doing that. What you need to understand is the concept of how to reach the smoothness. Once you understand the concept, you will see that in any situation that you want to fly, you will get good results. Although it may seem complex at first, once you find the sweet spot for your system, you will never need to set anything on your PC again. Just open your simulator, enter in VR, and just simply fly. From now on, I imagine that you know that for each kind of flight, you will use different amounts of CPU and GPU resources, right? Flying the Airbus A320 like I'm flying right now with a payware JFK scenario at night during rain, using the VATSIM with about 40 airplanes connected around. This situation that I'm describing for you now, it's not using the same computational complexity as flying an helicopter during daytime in the Flight Simulator 24 in a mountainous area, no clouds around. To follow this tutorial, the ideal is to select the worst aircraft that you have with the most complex airport scenario that you have in your gallery. That way you're gonna have a good parameter to measure. As soon as you reach smoothness in that worst scenario, you will certainly have resources to spare in lighter scenarios flying in situations that are not so GPU demanding. You will notice that we will talk about three major things in this video: GPU usage, hertz frequency, and frames per second. Almost all the video will be talking about these parameters. Because I have background in technology, nothing that we'll see that we are applying here will be using feeling that I think now is smoother or now I think is better. No, we're gonna use graphs and numbers to really prove the concept, and I will show you that the concept is really working with the resources that we can measure inside the scene using some tools. So to have a good visualization about how much GPU resources that we are using, we use the GPU-Z. I strongly recommend you to use the software because there are several settings in Windows 10 and Windows 11 that can change the usage that we are seeing, for example, in the task manager. The software is also practical because all the changes that we made with the sim will be recorded in this temporary graph that allow us to make a good quick comparison. And we will temporarily activate the FPS counter in the Flight Simulator 2024 to get an idea of how the system is balanced with the CPU and GPU usage. To activate the frames per second counter inside the Flight Simulator, we're gonna go here in Settings, Advanced Options, activate Developer Mode, and now we have this bar here upside. Click in Debug, Display FPS, and now we will have a good way to measure some parameters here inside the sim. In Flight Simulator 2020, Options, General Options, Developer Mode, Enable Developer Mode. Now we have this toolbar here, Debug, and then Display FPS, and we're gonna have the Display FPS here. To open your MetaQuest app, just go to this folder in the screen below, check the tab Devices, MetaQuest, Graphic preferences, make sure that we are in 72 Hz and using automatic recommended render resolution. We will fine tune these parameters later. Click OK, and then you can minimize the app. But before we talk about frames per second and hertz frequency, the human vision is very sensitive to movements, especially in VR where we are constantly doing rotational and translational movements. Therefore, any frame loss during these fast movements are easily noticeable by our eyes. Imagining moving your head from here to here. During this camera trajectory, we create 36 frames within this 1 second. If you lost a frame during this movement, our eyes and our brain will notice this lack of continuity. This creates a terrible user experience because the movements in VR are not matching with what our eyes are used to see. This is why many people feel nausea or discomfort when using these headsets for the first time. Most of the time, it's due to this lack of proper configuration and frame continuity. Let's now do a quick review about Gsync and Freesync technology. We know that every game usually varies the frames per second depending on the scene that you are in. Look into your overhead panel with the sky in the background. We will use a lot less GPU than looking down to your airplane's pedestal with the terrain on the background. Since we make a lot of movements, many cameras and different positions, this will cause a huge fluctuation in GPU usage and frames per second. With this variation, monitors and displays with the Gsync and Freesync technology are able to dynamically change their hertz frequency to adapt to the frames per second variation that the graphics card are able to generate. For example, if your simulator is fluctuating between 40 to 55 frames per second, the monitor can adapt its hertz frequency to match the same speed that your GPU is able to create. If your monitor are not able to keep in sync with your GPU, you will experience stutters, freezes, misalignment, screen tearing, and etc. But why we are talking about Gsync technology in a VR video? The Quest 2 and the Quest 3 and 90% of the other headsets in the market unlikely display monitors with the Gsync and Freesync technology. They have a fixed refresh rate. What does this mean? To have a smooth image, we need to match the frames per second from the flight simulator exactly to the same hertz frequency that the headset is set to run. So if your headset is set to 72 Hz, you cannot have 71 or 73 frames per second. You need to be exactly at 72 frames per second. Got it? But we know that it's almost impossible to achieve 72 frames per second in the Flight Simulator 2020, Flight Simulator 2024 in VR, because we are talking about massive resolutions. However, we have an alternative for this. It's possible to set the simulator to run at half of the headset's refresh rate. Even in this scenario, we will have a perfect image synchronization using this trick. 36 frames per second, which is half of the 72 Hz. It's already something achievable in the frames per second target, right? The same applies to your headset at 80 Hz. We need to maintain 40 frames per second. If you use 90 Hz, half will be 45 frames per second constantly. But to maintain this 36 frames per second, we will use a proper tool that is developed to lock the frames per second in the headset. If you use any external software like Riva Tuner or Nvidia app or Nvidia control panel, those methods should only be used to lock your frames per second in your monitor, not your headset. And I can prove you that doing this the wrong way will have a negative impact in the smoothness. Let me introduce you to the Oculus Debug tool. With this software, we can restrict the frames per second, but also adjust a bunch of other things. To access the Oculus Debug tool, you need to go to this folder that will be in the screen. First, I will give you a basic overview of the available functions and the difference in each settings. I will start here at the bottom. All the settings are fixed, meaning you can restart your computer or the headset or the debug tool. All those settings will remain the same in this area. Since I use the headset with a generic link cable, I can easily maintain 400 megabits per second transmission without any issues. If you use AirLink, the speed on your Wi-Fi network will determine how many megabits per second you will be able to use. Using Wi-Fi, it's an extra layer of complexity that you are adding to your experience in the operation in the headset. I recommend you leaving everything else here the same as I use here. Encode resolution and dynamic bitrate are set to 0 to tell the debug tool that we want to choose the maximum resolution and bandwidth available. Now in the upper part of the debug tool, all the settings are temporary. Everything you set here will be lost if you turn off the headset or close the Oculus link. They will always be reset to 0 or 1, in this case the FOV tangent multiplier. So to confirm the current setting, always close and reopen the debug tool because it doesn't update in real time. If something in the background changes these parameters, you will only notice if you close it and open it again. There's a way to adjust these three parameters: pixel override, the FU tangent multiplier, and also the Asynchronous Space warp, only using one click, and I will show you in the end of the video how to do that. Now let's dive deeper into what each item in this area of the debug tool does. For each setting that I change, we are talking about extreme resolutions. Most of the settings in the debug tool will primarily impact your GPU. Since I'm a developer, I can keep the headset screen on all the time, even with the Quest here on my table away from my face. This is just to make the tweaking part a little easier. However, everything you are going to apply here must be done with the headset on your face for the changes to take an effect. Most of the time, I'm also using the Oculus Mirror that is exactly like the name say. Everything that are being reproduced here inside the headset are being rendered in this software called Oculus Mirror. I will show you the link in the description where you can open this app. And the other side of the screen is my flight simulator running. So everything that you see here in the tutorial have these two sides, the flight simulator and also the final result image that we are able to see inside the headset, but we are able to reproduce here in my computer to make image quality comparisons a little bit easier. I will get inside VR now, and let's see the difference with those modes in the Asynchronous Space warp. This is the official software that we will use to limit the frames per second in simulator. Remember that I said that the frames per second needs to be done with a tool developed by the manufacturer itself, not by Nvidia app or the Nvidia control panel. And before we begin, just to clarify, this name 45 FPS means half of refresh rate. In the past, the first headsets were only capable to run at 90 Hz. So half refresh rate means this 45 frames per second. But Meta never renamed this parameter in the debug tool. So understand 45 frames per second, this name here, as half refresh rate. With this disable option, we are removing the synchronization of the simulator frames per second with the headset. So if your headset is set to 72 Hz, when switch ASW to disable, you will notice a frames per second increase. The GPU usage will almost reach 100%. We are now reaching 97% GPU usage. Now observe the half refresh rate with space warp disable. The frames per second will now reduce to 35 frames per second. The GPU load is now at 73% usage. And when we set to disable, you will notice the frames per second increasing. The GPU usage now running about 97% usage, and you go from 36 frames per second to now 50 frames per second. But now I have a question. What do you think will be smoother? 36 frames per second synchronized with the headset at 72 Hz, or here in disable with the frames per second varying from 45 to 50 frames per second without synchronization? When we are talking about monitors, the answer is a bit obvious for some people. 50 frames per second will be smoother than 36, right? But in the world of virtual reality, it's a completely the opposite. And I will prove you with the numbers and graphs. Continuing here in the debug tool, we have this HUD graph that will be visible as soon as you put your headset. You can enable it using here's visible head-up display, performance head-up display, and select mode latency timing. This graph is very useful to check how smooth are the frame synchronization. Notice that when I set the ASW to disable, our GPU is now generating the max frames per second as possible, using almost 100% of the GPU load, and we lost the synchronization between frames per second that the Quest screen are set to, the 72 Hz, And if you move your head inside the sim right now, you will notice that even though the frames per second are higher, the lack of continuity in these frames make the image some choppy and with broken movements and stutters. And this graph never lies. Notice how unstable the synchronization continuity is. Now observe when I turn the force 45 frames per second, half of refresh rate, with the headset set to 72 Hz. The simulator is stabilized now in 36 frames per second. And look at this graph again. All generated frames are now matched with the speed of the Quest panels, and the movement becomes extremely smooth inside the headset. And also notice that we are now around 80 to 81, 82% of GPU load. But reducing the frames per second to half of the refresh rate, we are getting two small issues. If you are at 72 Hz and the flight simulator is only creating half of those frames, those missing frames will generate a bit of ghosting. This is absolutely normal because for each update cycle that we have in the screens of the headset, we are missing a frame from the simulator. We can address this issue by using Space Warp in Enable mode. When we enable this function, the Oculus software can take those frames from the simulator and interpolate a fake frame between them. The simulator is still running at 36 frames per second, but the Oculus now is showing real 72 frames in the headset for us. The motion will be a lot smoother for our eyes. However, in fast movements, those frames often cannot accurately predict what will be the next frame. This generates a horrible distortion that it's almost impossible to use. If I move the controller fast in front of the camera, notice how the edges of this controller start to deform. The same thing happened in the outside view. See that the wingtip now is having this distortion in fast movements. Some places with lower contrast will also have this horrible effect. If you are looking to the sky, for example, look how the edges of the objects will start to deform. The pixel override is one of the most important features. Here, we will do the super sampling of the resolution. Remember that the Quest 2 have the resolution of 1823 by 1920 and the Quest 3 2064 by 1280. Increasing the number of pixels, we are throwing a much large image into a small compact screen space in our display. The biggest gain here is the reduction of the jagged lines and also better clarity to read small texts, numbers, letters in our airplane display panels. Keep in mind that we are pushing hard the GPU doing that. We are going from the native resolution in the Quest 3, for example, of 2064 by 2280 to something like 2703 by 2900 for each eye. Now that we know how to limit the frames per second at half of refresh rate using the Space Warp, and we understand the concept of super sampling, we can now start doing some experiments. As soon as we start the Debug Tool, all temporary settings will be at 0, pixel display override, and also field of view. Those parameters in 0 means that we will have native resolution at the Quest, and we will also have 100% of field of view. 0 and 1 will be the same thing here in Oculus Debug Tool. I will get inside VR now, and let's see the difference between native resolution and the super sampling. Get inside VR. I will now limit the frames per second and enforce 45 frames per second. That means half refresh rate. Now our flight sim are running at 36 frames per second. And we are achieving almost the native resolution, 2064 by 2208 of the native resolution of the Quest 3. And the GPU usage is around 74-75% usage. Now let's try to bump up the resolution to something like 20% more. 1.2. We get out of VR, get inside VR again. We are now using the resolution of 2480 by 2720, and our GPU are running at 98% usage. Those 20% increase of resolution will bump up the clarity in the instruments in the panel, but with a huge cost, that is the GPU usage. Another resource that we can also use to further increase the clarity of the panels and the instruments is the use of the field of view. The concept here is to reduce the size of the screen that are being rendered. In short, we will cut the corners of the image to a point where we start to see some black bars around the edges. Yes, now we are entering in a graphics quality lost territory, but we are seeking to a significant increase in sharpness. When we reduce this area to be rendered in the headset displays, we are releasing a lot of GPU resources which can now be used to perform a higher supersampling on the center of the image. Let me give you an example. Reducing the field of view to 70%, we are removing around 30% of the GPU load in our graphics card. And now we can use those 30% to further increase the supersampling. Let's get back to 0 here in pixel override, and now let's see how much GPU resources we will relieve only by using 70% of the field of view. Get out of VR, get inside VR again. We are now at 70% using 70% field of view with 0 pixel override, but the GPU load is now at 56-55% usage. Now let's try to crank up the resolution to pixel override in 1.6. We are still using almost 78-77% of your GPU, but the difference in clarity, it's something huge. I will show you the comparison. Look at these numbers using 1.6 pixel override and 70% of the field of view. Remember that we are using about 86-85% in GPU load. Now let's change to pixel override 0 and no field of view reduction. Let's get out of VR, get inside VR again. Look at the difference. Now with the pixel override in 0, no supersampling are being applied, no field of view reduction, using almost the same GPU load, 78-79% GPU load. But look at the difference between the image clarity from this to this. Huge, right? Look how much sharper the instruments are when we are doing supersampling and reducing the field of view. Look the side-by-side comparison image. Again, as a pilot, we use almost 100% of the time the airplane instruments. Reducing the field of view to something like 70%, I'm able to pack 30% more pixels in the center of the screen. This is a huge impact in the image clarity, especially in the center of the image. But if for you field of view is more important, you'll never achieve the same level of sharpness that I have here in this configuration. Another important point to monitor is always the GPU load. Remember that I mentioned that each flight requires a completely different computational power. Every time we are flying using 72 Hz, 80 Hz, 90 Hz, we need to pay attention to how much GPU we are using. If the Quest is set to 72 Hz, remember that we cannot let the frames per second drop below the 36, or we will lose that synchronization and we will start to have stutters. To maintain a good safety margin, the magic number that I recommend is stay below 75-80% GPU usage. But we are leaving a lot of performance on the table by using so little resources, right? Again, what is your priority? Here, I prioritize smoothness and sharpness. Remember that the flight simulator uses a good portion of the GPU work, but Windows also uses it. The parallel softwares that the simulator uses also use GPU. The Phoenix A320, for example, uses an absurd amount of DLL files in the background. So you need to have at least this 20% headroom. Every time your GPU reaches around 95%, the simulator will start dropping the frames per second to 34, 32 frames per second, and the smoothness will be absolutely gone. So it's crucial to maintain this GPU headroom. And also, you may have noticed that the higher the headset's hertz frequency, the higher the GPU usage will be. Some people, for example, they insist that 90 Hz is the minimum that they can use the simulator. However, at 90 Hz, the simulator will need to maintain 45 frames per second all the time. But to maintain 45 frames per second, using 75-80% of GPU, you need to drastically reduce the resolution. You have already understood that if you want to have sharpness and smoothness, you need to use 72 Hz and 36 frames per second. This way, you have a lot of GPU resources to further increase the final resolution. Here we are using about 80% GPU load with pixel override in 1.6, using 70% of the field of view. maintaining 36 frames per second. That is half a refresh rate of the 72 Hz that the Quest is set to run. Now let's change this to 90 Hz. MetaQuest app, devices, touch control, graphic preferences, 90 Hz, and save and restart. With the panels in 90 Hz, we are now using almost 100% of GPU load. We are not able to keep the 45 frames per second that is minimal. And look, the latency timing graph, absolute garbage, the frame synchronization again. So to maintain the GPU load below 80%, we will need to reduce the resolution a lot. Let's try 1.2, go out of VR, get inside of VR again. And now we are back in 80% GPU load, but we need to reduce from 1.6 to 1.3 the final resolution. So again, if for you 90 Hz is the minimum, you need to understand that you need to reduce the resolution a lot to maintain this GPU headroom of around 20% GPU load. And also you will lose a lot of clarity because you need to reduce a lot of resolution to stay within this range of 75 to 80% GPU load. The Auto FPS is one of those essential tools that I have here. My terrain distance, object distance, and the clouds are controlled dynamically by this application. Basically, when I'm below 200 feet, my terrain level of detail will be at 70. This is the moment when I'm especially looking to the runway during the approach and landing. And it's not important to have the terrain at long distance with sharp resolution at this moment when I'm in a final approach. And every time that we are also parking in the airport below those 200 feet, the terrain level of detail will be at 70 because we are around a lot of things in the aerodrome when we are not seeing further away from the aircraft. As soon as we take off, it will dynamically change from 70 to 200, from 200 feet until 2000 feet. Reaching 2000 feet will now be at 200. The steps will be 5 by 5 to increase the terrain level of detail. The same goes for clouds. Decreasing cloud quality. Remember that we have to keep your GPU usage always below 75 to 80%, right? With this cloud adjustment, I'm telling to the system that as soon as my GPU usage exceeds 90%, it should lower the cloud quality from high to medium or from medium to low, always dropping one level. The cloud quality will start to back up to medium and higher as soon as my GPU usage drops below 75%. In other words, without needing to remove your headset, you can dynamically make these important performance adjustments, releasing a little bit more GPU resources to increase again the resolution. The OpenXR Toolkit is one of the essential softwares that I'm also using to get best performance and sharpness. I recommend you visit the developer's website to read more about it. First, go to the menu and show expert settings, select yes. Now several functions will be displayed, especially here in the performance page. On the first tab, performance, we will use upscaling with CAS. All those settings will give the same performance results, but CAS generally has the less shimmery. Sharpness, I use 100%. For the panel clarity, sharpness is one of the essentials that we have in this tool. That's why I use in 100%. FOV Rendering will help you to free at least 3 to 5% of performance. I will show you. In off, we are using now 81% of GPU load. Now I will enable the custom preset, and we are coming from 80 to 77, 76, dipping down to 76% GPU usage. We are talking about 3 to 5% performance that we gain only enabling these presets here on the fixed FOV rendering. With those settings, the inner ring, the center of the image, is being rendered at 100%. As soon as my peripheral vision runs from 55 to 75% of the center, I'm rendering the image with half of the quality. Further away, at 75% outwards, the outer ring is rendering 1/16 of the resolution. You will notice some artifacts like here in the corner of the image, but this is not visible inside the headset. And the possibility to make this offset down, make the rings a little bit lower in the image, that's what make my instruments being absolutely clear and then parts that I'm not looking for, like the sky and the clouds above my peripheral vision, are not being rendered 100%. So we are not losing any kind of visual clarity, reducing the resolution in peripheral vision, and we are gaining a considerably amount of performance to, again, bump up a little bit more the resolution. Turbo mode I use on Flight Simulator 2020 and Flight Simulator 2024. Here on Appearance tab, I use these settings. Again, from a real pilot perspective, the panels in Flight Simulator 2020 and Flight Simulator 2024 are ridiculously too bright without any contrast, especially on very sunny days. This is not what we see in real life. The brighter the day outside, the darker the cabin interior will become. To mitigate this, I'm adjusting the contrast over the 80 and reduce the brightness slightly to 40. I reduce a little bit of color saturation. Both simulators, Flight Simulator 2020 and Flight Simulator 2024, looks like a Disney theme park. Too much colors. This doesn't exist in real life. Look at the difference from off to on. It's absolutely essential to use this software nowadays. Here on the input tab, I'm using -100. I recommend you to testing this gradually. Since I do a lot of live streams, using this feature makes my camera movements a little bit smoother, not too much shaky. And also the controllers feels more smooth due to the movements. I recommend you to do not use this feature because it will give you the sensation of being like drunk with a huge delay in the movements. You notice that I'm using the version 1.3.8. That is the mod that Ohne Speed on YouTube are developing. For people that use the virtual desktop, it's not possible to use the FOV like we are using here in the Debug Tool. However, this mod are allowing people to change the FOV when using virtual desktop. If you are interested in make these adjustments, I will leave the link in the video description. But remember that we are using the FOV on the Debug Tool, so those settings will not apply here for us using this software. These settings in this mod only will work with virtual desktop. My in-game settings for Flight Simulator 20 and Flight Simulator 2024 are absolutely the same. So everything that I will show you here in Flight Simulator 2024 will be applied to Flight Simulator 2020 seamless. Remember, you will be disappointed with what you are seeing here, but this is a pilot perspective. My only one priority is to have the maximum sharpness on the panels. So let's go to settings and in VR mode, VR graphics. It's already clear at this point that using TLAA is mandatory. Watch this comparison between TLAA and DLSS 4 in VR. DLSS is an excellent technology, but for it to be useful for us pilots, it needs to evolve significantly when it comes to instrument sharpness. If you fly using an aerobatic aircraft flying with the external view over the buildings in New York City, this is certainly the technology for you. But real pilots like us who use the instruments 100% of the time, DLSS is still absolutely unacceptable. DLSS needs a higher frames per second for the predictions of the frame to be effective. This is not a reality here in VR. Remember that we are running the flight simulator at 36 frames per second. Another thing that is necessary is the size of the instruments. In virtual reality, we are sitting in the real position like in the real aircraft. So the numbers that we are looking in the panel are further away from us. So the speed tapes and the number in the altitudes need to be filled with fake frames will always be compromised because of the distance that we are from those numbers. This is why some people are posting good results with the G1000 panel, for example. The numbers in the G1000 are bigger. People are not using VR, using the camera closest to the panel. That's why the technology works in that panels. This is not a reality for us here in VR. Here in general quality, remember, everything almost in the lowest setting as possible. Remember that terrain level of detail, object of the level detail, and volumetric clouds are controlled by the auto FPS, not by the simulator. Texture resolution and everything else is almost in the minimal as possible. Render scaling in 100% and also the sharpening in 200. My in-game graphics settings is almost the same like in the Flight Simulator 2024. TLAA with sharpenings in 200. Everything the same as the Flight Simulator 2024. terrain level of detail, objects level of detail, and clouds controlled by Auto FPS. My NVIDIA control panel and also my NVIDIA app, everything is set to default, except Power Manage mode to prefer mode performance. I don't use gaming mode, and also hardware acceleration GPU scheduling are set to off, as I promised. To be able to control everything inside the debug tool using only one click, I will leave the link in the description for this file where you will find all the commands that I use to modify the pixel override, modify the FOV, and also control the space warp in all those options here, only using some bat files. First, you need to extract all those files. On the C, you need to create a folder inside C, name it VR. So it will only works in this folder, C VR, because all the files here are calling functions that are addressed to this folder. C VR, everything is named to C and VR, the folder. Okay, everything is now extracted there. As soon as you open the folder C VR, you will have all these comments. For example, everything now is set to default, 0, 0, and also space warp in disable. As soon as I click in ADB pixel 1, it will call this function from Oculus Debug Tool and open this text file. We start here, and then if you open the debug tool again, you'll see that we are now in 1.1, the FOV in 70%, and space warp in 45 disable, that is half of refresh rate. If I want to change to 1.5, I have this one here. As soon as you open the debug tool again, 1.5, 70%, forced a space warp. If I want to disable space warp, reprojection disable, and now as soon as you open the debug tool, space warp is disabled. As you can imagine, all these functions can be called using VoiceAttack. Reprojection off.
Space warp in half refresh.
Reprojection on.
Space warp in half refresh plus reprojection.
Refresh 90. Refresh 80. Refresh rate. What is happening is the VoiceAttack is calling those bat files, so you never need to remove your headset because everything that you want to change here inside the debug tool can be called by the VoiceAttack using those bat files. Remember that ADB tools need to be here in this folder. If you want to enable ADB commands, I suggest you to find some videos about how to enable these advanced functions to be able to execute a lot of commands directly using voice or using bat files like I have here. Now that we know how to manage all these resources to extract maximum performance from your system, it's up to you to identify your priorities. If your goals are the same as mine, you now have all the necessary tools and resources to start balancing your system in a practical and simple way. Always keep your GPU Z on the screen, look to the numbers and graphs, select your worst aircraft, the most complex airport scenery, and start your journey to keep the GPU usage below 80% range. That's simple as that. If you are exceeding this 80% limit, the first step is to reduce the resolution. But if you don't want to lose sharpness, working with a smaller FOV will definitely help you to free up a lot of resources and be able to bump up the resolution. Well, that was a good overview of all the knowledge that I had about VR. I hope I was able to share at least 2 cents with the community. I would like to leave a sincere opinion. Virtual reality is a brilliant tool that brings home flight simulation really close to what are the real world operation. The fact that you need to move your hands, your controllers, inside the cockpit to adjust switches in the overhead panel, in the pedestal and in the autopilot creates a very close connection to what we do in the real world operation. Today, I can no longer see myself flying using a display monitor connected to a PC. Even though the graphic quality is still far inferior to the sharpness that we get using a 4K monitor, the immersion that we gain compensates for any loss. Going back to fly using monitors, it's a huge step backwards. I guarantee that this is true because we already have several certified professional simulators worldwide that are adopting VR as the primary means of operation. Watch this video, for example, of Loft Dynamics on the YouTube channel. They are already with the flight training device level 3 certification. This is the future of pilot training, and we are already having this opportunity to have everything that we see in the professional environment at home with our headsets. That's it for today, guys. If you think that this knowledge helped you in a certain way, please consider subscribing my channel and leave a like. See you soon. Bye.